Good evening and a really warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening, both in person at King's Place and online. My name is Alex Crook. I'm the communications lead for the Turing Institute's public policy program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of this year's Turing Lecture Series, In AI We Trust, in partnership with the Knowledge Quarter. For those of you who are new to the Turing Lectures, welcome back. Welcome, and for those returning, welcome back. Can I get a quick show of hands in the room for everyone for whom this is your first Turing Lecture? Almost everyone. That is fantastic, and welcome to the Turing Lectures. To introduce the Alan Turing Institute, we're the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, and the Turing Lectures are our flagship event series, and we've been running them since 2016. This year's series comes as the Turing is embarking on a new strategy focused on generating high-quality research and translating it into real-world impact and deployment. Our goals are to advance world-class research and apply it to national and global challenges, to build skills for the future, and to drive an informed public conversation around data science and AI, which is why we're all here today. And this year also marks our first Turing Lecture Series in partnership with the Knowledge Quarter, which is one of the greatest knowledge clusters in the world. It's got over 100 organizations, academic, scientific, cultural, and media, one of which is the Alan Turing Institute, and another of which is King's Place, which is the beautiful venue we're in today. You'll want to sign up for their newsletter if you're local. It's the best way to stay updated on all the amazing events that are happening in the neighborhood. So this 2024 series of the Turing Lectures explores the complex relationship between AI and society, examining its impact on our democratic processes, on decision-making systems, and crucially, on trust. This year, nearly half of the world's population has been or will be eligible to vote in global elections. And at the same time, there's a growing societal recognition that AI technologies, from algorithmic decision-making to automated online content generation, are shaping political discourse, influencing public opinion, and potentially affecting the outcomes of democratic processes. And one of the challenges facing us is understanding not just how these technologies impact the mechanics of voting and governance, but also how they affect the nature of trust in our democratic institutions, which leads us on to this evening's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Bright. Jonathan is head of AI for public services and head of online safety in the Turing's public policy program, which works with policymakers to develop innovative, data-driven solutions to wicked policy problems and develops ethical frameworks for the use of AI in the public sphere. Jonathan's research concerns how AI creates new opportunities to improve the functioning of government and democracy, but also how it creates novel risks and threats, particularly online. Before coming to the Turing, Jonathan was an associate professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is part of the University of Oxford, and he's a former editor of the journal Policy and Internet. He's a widely published author in the area of online safety, online harms, and democracy, and a member of the Council of Europe Committee of Experts on Online Safety and Empowerment of Content Creators and Users. Jonathan is going to be leading tonight's conversation, but we do want to hear from you, so please tweet your thoughts at TuringInst using the hashtag Turing Lectures, and we're going to have about 20 minutes at the end to ask Jonathan questions. If you're online, that will be via Slido, and if you're in the audience in person, you'll be able to ask Jonathan directly. So with that, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure for me to have this chance to talk to you a little bit about our research on AI and democracy, and also to try and fit this into the bigger picture. We live in a time where technology is doing things that 5 or 10 years ago we would have thought is kind of impossible. You know, go back 15 years and explain this photo to someone. I guarantee it would be difficult, right? And what I want to try and do today is throw out some thoughts about how this technology is potentially affecting and shaping our democracy, and also bring in some of the things that we've been doing at the Turing Institute to try and make sense of some of this. Now, I was thinking about how to start this talk, and I thought, well, starting this talk, even though it's about right now, it's about today, we actually need to go further back to put this into a little bit of context. So I want to go back to another amazing time. Cool Britannia, the time of Cool Britannia. Let's have another show of hands. Who, like me, can remember this time? Okay, It says something about the demographic I'm able to attract. I've got some bad news. If you're old enough to remember this, you're old. Because this was a long time ago. If you're not old enough to remember this, congratulations, let me fill you in. This was a moment when it was perceived as kind of cool to be British. We had cool pop stars. We had cool singers. You know, I'll leave it up to you to say which one of these stood the test of time, if anything. We also had cool members of the royal family. We even had maybe slightly cool politicians. Again, this was a long time ago. This was, I was young at this moment, but not so young that I couldn't remember it. And this was kind of an inspiring time to be growing up. And the reason I'm bringing it up is not to go down memory lane of the music, but it was also a cool time. Apart from being a cool time for Britannia, it was also kind of a cool time for democracy. The 1990s, the early 2000s were a moment when people felt really positive about democracy. They thought it was really going somewhere. This came after what Huntington called the third wave of democratization, where places like Spain and Portugal and South Korea, and most especially Eastern Europe and Baltic states, seemed to be moving towards democracy, symbolized another key part of public consciousness, which I can also remember reasonably well, by the fall of the Berlin Wall, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the gradual democratization of all the states that were previously authoritarian there. We were so confident about democracy in this moment that we were even going to war to promote it or to defend it in Sierra Leone, in Eastern Europe, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Of course, these weren't the only reasons those wars happened, but the ideology of promoting democracy is such a great idea that if we just turn up and shoot everyone that disagrees with us, the democracy will break out spontaneously. This was a widely held point of view. And it was driven by the facts. This is from Our World in Data, a great resource if you haven't come across it. And without going into details, it's saying here the percentage of the world's population that's living under democracy. I won't go through all the categories, but the blue ones are kind of democracy, and the red and yellow, you're more or less living under an autocracy or a type of dictatorship where you don't have free choice in your elected leaders. And going back to the 1900s, of course, vanishingly few people lived in what today we would recognize as a democracy. But with the extension of the franchise, with the end of colonialism and imperialism, with the fall, as I said, of the Soviet Union, we gradually saw what Huntington was called these waves of democratization sweeping across the world. And when you get to the 1990s and early 2000s, you start to see a tipping point. For the first time, more than 50% of the world's population living under democratic rule. Fukuyama summarized this, and I don't mean to single him out because it was a widely held view at the time, summarized this saying, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passage of a particular period of history, but the end of history as such, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. Looking back now, it seems absurd that we could have thought like this, that we've kind of got to the end of history. We've completed history. History is done, everything's looking good. But it was a really widespread feeling at the time. And why I think it's important to bring this up in a lecture on what's going on with AI and democracy right now is a lot of our thinking about why democracy was in such a positive space then, especially in the early 2000s, was driven by views on technology. I remember this protest, the 2007, a protest in Myanmar, was widely covered as a moment where Facebook started to enable collective action. And Facebook was described in this article, and not only this article, as a pro-democracy sledgehammer. Isn't it amazing what this social network is going to do to spread democracy around the world? When we saw the revolutions of the Arab Spring, this is Tahrir Square in Egypt, a lot of people attributed these to the power of social networks, especially Twitter, their ability to spread democracy. When Bill Clinton was asked about China and the internet, he said, well, controlling the internet is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. If you need a translation, Jell-O means jelly. nailing it to the wall is what he said. It can't be done. Authoritarians can't control this internet. And again, a very widely held view that the internet and social media would enable people to get access to the public sphere, enable new people to speak in democracies, would enhance collective action, make it easier for people to come together and take action, increase the scrutiny of elites, make it harder for them to get away with things. In other words, it would be a hugely pro-democratic force. And what we can say about this thinking is that those days really do seem a long time ago. And that optimism that we had about democracy and that we had about technology has receded considerably. I know very few people now talking in these optimistic terms that democracy is about to sweep the world or that technology is going to clear the way for democratic revolutions. Now, of course, it wasn't all going the right way even back then. Some revolutions that we thought were about to happen, especially in places like China, just didn't materialize. Some countries have ended up sliding back from looking like they're about to democratize into what are very clearly patterns of authoritarian rule. And this applies not just in Russia, but also, this is Hungary, also in the European Union. If we go back to our chart, which I had finishing in 2003, you can see my one contribution to this chart has been this huge black line. You can see that if we look on a little bit further, the number of people, the percentage of people living in democracy starting to decline. And perhaps more importantly than that, certainly from our perspective here in the UK, is not just that around the world democracy isn't sweeping around, but also at home, people are starting to lose a little bit of faith in democracy. They're starting to view it differently. Here is, the data goes so long that I had to find two charts pointing it out. Here's from YouGov, satisfaction of British adults with their government, starting in 2003 and ending in 2024. I took this, I think, yesterday, in fact. There's only 3 times in more than 20 years when British people have said, according to YouGov, that they're satisfied with the work of their government. And this covers, all sorts of changes in government, and those moments of satisfaction largely coinciding, in fact, exclusively coinciding with either change of prime minister or a change of government. Keir Starmer, he's got a job on his hands. Very, very briefly, people said he was doing all right. The first couple of days went well, and then immediately it's gone back to disapproval. So we disapprove systematically of what our governments are doing, but also we're starting to disapprove a little bit of democracy itself. This is from the Open Society Barometer, asking people around the world, is democracy your preferred form of government? In the UK, we can say 58% of people answering democracy as their preferred form of government. It's still a majority. That's somewhat comforting. But it doesn't feel as high as it should be, or nearly as high as it should be. It's a strikingly low figure. And if you look amongst younger cohorts, it's even lower than that. This is from a great article, Democratic Disconnect, a few years ago now, asking people, according to their year of birth, to what extent is it essential that a country is governed democratically? And the finding is very clear for the United States and for Europe. The older you are, the more likely you are to say it's essential. If you go to people who were born in the 1980s, it's a few years back, so that still counts as the young people for the purposes of this article, it's slipping down to 30%. We get the same figures, these are worldwide figures, I should say, not necessarily for the UK, the same figures in the Open Society Barometer. To what extent do you favor army rule as a means of government? People 18 to 35 years old, an astonishing statistic to my mind, giving 42% saying that they're more or less happy with that they think this is a good idea. So our sort of collective faith in democracy, I wouldn't say it's entirely faded away, but it's certainly troubled, certainly has faded a lot since these last 20 years. And the technologies that I mentioned, these social media, these internet, everything that was supposed to bring us to the promised land, has also gone through a complete role reversal and is now regarded totally differently in the history of democracy. First of all, I think most people have put to bed the idea that you can't tame the internet, China has shown just how much you can control online thought and online behavior. And within the West, we've gone from saying Facebook is a pro-democracy sledgehammer to Facebook has destroyed democracy. No, actually it was Twitter that destroyed, and Google destroyed democracy. They're all queuing up to destroy democracy. One of the first potential titles for this talk is, Will AI Destroy Democracy? But it's already been destroyed several times, so it's hard to destroy it again. And again, this is, for me, for someone who's been studying this type of thing for more than 10 years now and has grown up throughout these changes, it's a really striking change. So that, I think, is really important context for today's talk, which is trying to pick away at the question, not answer, I don't think we can fully answer it now, but try and pick away at the question, what are going to be some of the consequences of AI for democracy? Now, I should pause there and say a little bit about AI. Now, I'm not here to try and explain all of AI to you. Alex mentioned the Turing Lectures have been going on for a while. There's a great lecture from last year by Mike Wooldridge if you want to dig into the details of large language models and generative AI. Where do they come from? Where are they going? What are they doing? I recommend that to you. I'll just say a few brief things about it. The first thing is that AI, artificial intelligence, as a field of study, it's been around for a while. It's been around for quite a while. People have been thinking about it since at least the 50s. Turing, who gave his name to our institute, published some of the early articles on this. It's a field that's gone through peaks and troughs, waves of excitement followed by disillusionment. There was a famous AI conference in the 1970s where Minsky famously declared, in 3 to 8 years' time, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of the average human being. Again, this proved wildly optimistic. But there's definitely a feeling that right now, and it's always hard to divorce yourself a little bit from hype cycles, but there's definitely a feeling that right now we've hit some kind of change point in uptake of AI, in the ability of technology to deliver. And we now see things like OpenAI, or like the thing that generated the picture of Donald and Kamala that I showed to you right at the beginning, that do things that previously, going even 10 years back, we would have said would be quite hard to do, or we didn't necessarily think were imminent. And I think one thing that really sums up the pace of change to me, this is from Life Architect website, which I recommend to you if you're interested in this kind of thing, is the amount of money going into the AI field and the corresponding increase in size of the AI models that we're working with. And when we say size of a model, this broadly means the number of parameters that were within the model, which is a very rough approximation, could be thought a little bit like the neurons in a human brain. They're not exactly the same by any means, but it's sort of somewhat inspired by some of the same thinking. Now, what we can see, this is a visualization of AI models which are either out or are planned to be coming, as I said, from the Life Architect model. And what you can see is that ChatGPT is up here, this kind of little moon hanging around over here. And if we look forward to some of the things which are already out, or some of the things which are planned, Olympus, for example, coming from Amazon, they're way, way bigger than what we've previously been used to. We're talking about orders of magnitude increases. And why is this important? Well, as the scale of AI increases, typically, all else being equal, the performance of these models increases. Their ability to do things, to perform tasks, to generate text, to generate realistic images, to generate video or audio also increases. In kind of in a similar way to the animals with the most neurons in their brain, so the biggest brains, although not necessarily biggest in size, but biggest in complexity, if you like, are typically more or less the most intelligent. So I think it's reasonable to expect, if we're not already there, technologies which can produce highly realistic text, images, audio, video that mimic anyone you like, basically, or anyone they have enough training data about. And it's the impact of this type of technology which I'm trying to pick away at in this talk. Now, I'm going to structure the talk, or the time I've got left, in terms of 3 parts. And these 3 parts are 3 sort of things that previously we thought internet and social media was helping to contribute to democracy, but in the end may have undermined a little bit. I want to talk about access to the public sphere, collective action, and scrutiny of elites. starting with access to the public sphere. The public sphere is a concept in political science that broadly means all the spaces and areas where people belonging to a public come together to discuss and interact and share ideas. And a lot of the time, although it's been debated exactly how this will work, but a lot of the time, this concept of the public sphere is closely associated with the idea of the print media. If you read some of the earliest histories of democracy and of the birth of the modern nation state, they'll highlight the importance of the invention of the printing press as a way of quickly distributing text and thoughts and ideas throughout a population. Benedict Anderson, who's written a great history here, I recommend it to you, called Imagined Communities, has said that this emergence of print, what he described as print capitalism, was fundamental to the founding of the modern nation state. Having media which distribute ideas around a public allow people to come together and think of themselves broadly in terms of a nation. And he said, and this was historically, he said, quite uncommon, and still a remarkable sort of human invention, the idea that you have things in common with people that you've never met and may live tens or hundreds of miles away from, but live in the same nation as you, is an invention, according to him, that's driven largely by these media. And I think most people would agree that fair and free and healthy democratic media is a vital part of democracy. But democratic media is something that we've seen considerably undermined over the last 10 years. So I want to talk about that, but before, it's time for you to participate in the talk. Yes, that's right. You have to do something as well. You can't just sit there and then have a drink. So we're going to go back to the Slido. You may have had time to do this while Alex was talking, but if not, you can join this Slido either by scanning this QR code with your mobile device or by going to slido.com and putting in the numbers here. If you're following online, this should be easy for you. I'm going to give people 5 or 10 seconds to fill this out and put some responses, and then we'll have a look at them. The first question is, do you trust the news? And let's see. We are the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, so it's somewhat of a tradition that when we try and use technology in a talk, it doesn't work. So far, it seems to be good. So you can keep voting. The votes are coming in. Don't let what other people are doing influence you, right? This is your moment of democratic decision. If you get the wrong answer, you will not be invited to the drinks afterwards. Great. I will leave another 5 or 10 seconds to go, and then we'll cut it off. Great. So what we can see there is approximately 40% of people saying they do not trust the news, 30% saying yes, and 27% saying not sure. That's great. And can we now go to the second of these slides? Would you pay for the news? So even though the majority of you don't trust the news, you would pay for it. Remarkable, remarkable finding. Very, very interesting. Okay, so about 50% of people saying they would pay for the news and 36% of people saying they wouldn't. So now can we go back to the slides, please? Now, I think these answers are interesting because they put us in a little bit of perspective as an audience compared to the UK at large. So this is a survey, it's back from 2019, asking people if they have high, medium, or low and no trust in the news. And what you can see is the UK is approximately similar to what we said. When 40% of people said they trust, if we take that to be high trust or medium trust, that puts us right here. But the UK is also at the bottom in terms of trust in the media out of all of these countries. So we live in an area or live in a polity where, relatively speaking, few people trust the news. And I think that's the result that we saw, that even amongst this audience, the majority of people not trusting the news. We also asked people proportion who would be willing to pay for the news. Now, this result doesn't quite ask the same thing. This is about paying for any online news. But only 8% of people in the UK are currently paying or willing to pay for any online news. Now, of course, the UK is a slight exception in this regard because we have the BBC, which is a large organization that produces news, which many people are already paying for. But what you can see, basically, And this is a pattern that, even though it's higher in different countries, it's still largely repeated, is that we're living in societies which are relatively distrustful of their news organizations and are relatively not keen to contribute any money to them. And this is really important because in the past, how was news funded? Well, lots of news, I mean, you did have to pay for a newspaper, perhaps, but a lot of the funding for news came through advertising. And one of the main ways that news organizations, both on television and in print, were able to support themselves was through adverts. And what we're seeing right now is a huge decline in advertising expenditure on newspaper organizations. Both of these things are from this House of Lords report, which came out a few years ago, which has contributed to hugely undermining the business model of contemporary news organizations. There's a very striking, this was just a couple of weeks ago, or was it even last week, final print edition of the Evening Standard, as it became a weekly edition. It simply can't support itself anymore. Now, what's some of the consequences of this, of the advertising money falling out of the news industry? Sam Friedman wrote a really interesting book about this. Well, not only about this, but it covered it, called Failed States. And he says that one of the things you see happening more and more in both print and online and on television is the increasing coverage of politics through the prism of what's sometimes called lobby journalism. In other words, focusing on personalities and what's going on with individuals rather than on the issues. And this is something that really resonates with me when I look at the current coverage of Keir Starmer's government. I'm not here to defend it or support it, but it's just very striking that we see a government which is already deeply unpopular. And yet, if you ask people, what do you know about this government, I bet the vast majority of them will respond on winter fuel payments and on various different types of free access things, be it clothes or sports events. Now, these are really important. But this is a government that also announced 30 or 40 new pieces of legislation as it arrived, covering all sorts of different areas, from pensions, from transport, creation of energy companies, creation of a sovereign wealth fund, you name it. Very few, I would struggle to name more than 10 of these. I think very few people are even aware of all of them. So this decline in the news media, which is partly driven by lack of advertising revenue in the internet age, it's much harder to get advertising revenue in the internet age, is one of the current things that's really troubling democracy, and one thing a lot of people point to. What's going to be the AI effect? What's going to be the AI impact on the news? Well, we can already see some impacts, some ways that this technology is going to be starting to be used by news media organizations. Some organizations are starting to make use of chatbots to write their own captions, to write their own, even write little leads, so the first little part of articles. Some journalists, of course, are using AI-generated articles and submitting them themselves. We're also seeing, and this is a little bit more concerning to my mind, the large-scale emergence of new types of news organizations, or at least sort of pseudo-news organizations, that produce AI-generated news at a large scale and aim to sort of blanket the internet with different types of automatically generated content. Now, these websites, which were called fake news websites around 10 years ago, then the whole term fake news got kicked around a little bit, but they used to be called fake news websites around 10 years ago, have been a constant problem for democratic action. These are two studies that we did over the last few years looking at anti-vaccination websites. We basically look at websites, and this study was done during the height of the COVID pandemic, when, of course, opinions on vaccination were extremely important. We looked at how websites were promoting themselves online and what they were using this promotion for. And we found a couple of things. So first of all, we looked at how websites would use anti-vaccination memes, short images with bits of text on them, to spread their content throughout social media. And we'd find a lot of these memes would start in community groups in North America, and then be spread out to different countries worldwide. And what would they be spreading? Well, we looked at, this is an example of an anti-vaccination website called vaccineimpact.com. And if you go onto this website, you'll find lots of news and opinions kind of undermining faith in vaccines. But if you look at, and you can do this through Google advertising cookies, if you look at the websites that are run in common with this website, you can see that it's selling a huge amount of alternative vaccine remedies on coconut oil or tropical traditions or things like this. In other words, you can build quite an effective business around creating sort of fake alarmist news websites and driving people to them, and then selling stuff alongside them. And in fact, this is another survey that we did a few months ago, or we put out a few months ago. What we're now seeing is that alongside people saying that they don't trust the news, people saying that they're more and more coming into contact with misinformation online. So in this survey, we asked people to say if they'd seen online misinformation many times, occasionally, very rarely, never. So basically, the orange and red colors are the ones where they've seen it most of all. And we see this is UK adults. An overwhelming quantity of people saying that they have seen, that they believe they've seen misinformation online, with many of them saying many times. And this being especially prevalent in the younger cohorts. So the news media, this is the kind of first, I realize this may be a little bit of a depressing talk, but you do get a drink afterwards, so you've got that to hang on to. The news media is already in a weak state, weakened by the arrival of the internet and social media, which has undermined its advertising business model. Now we have the emergence of AI, which may help news media reporting, but also presents this alternative method of competition and makes it easier for people to create fake news websites. So that's the first element. What about the element of collective action? I wanted to start this bit with a graphic that was made by Mark Zuckerberg. And he made this graphic a few years ago and released it in a blog. And he was trying to describe how patterns of engagement, meaning likes and comments and shares and reposts, etc., spread around on the Facebook platform compared to how controversial the content was. And his argument, which I think is accepted by the majority of people studying this field, is that the closer the content get to what he described as the policy line, the more controversial the content became, the more divisive the content became, the more polarizing the content became, the more engagement you started to see on the platform. In other words, he said, and I think many people would agree with him, that people on Facebook have an incentive to do things which are as divisive and misleading and polarizing as possible without going so far that you get banned from the platform. And this is one of the patterns of behavior that he saw driven a lot on Facebook. Now, all you can say to that is that this pattern maintains and to this day. The most recent debate in the US presidential election, you may have watched it, you may not have watched it, but if people remembered one thing from that debate, it was most likely this Trump comment on whether immigrants, especially Haitian immigrants, were eating pets and geese in the town of Springfield, Ohio. And it was immediately debunked and dismissed as being very likely to be untrue. But nevertheless, because of its divisive nature, because of its striking nature, and also because of the fact that people debated it, it pushed its way up into the news headlines and stayed there. And this is a formula which Trump, by accident or by design, has been using throughout his political career to generate attention and to keep the spotlight on him. Now, this type of misinformation, if you want to call it misinformation, is something that we've been talking about for the last 10 years in democracy. You may remember Comet Pizza in the US in 2016. Someone took an automatic weapon into Comet Pizza and started shooting up the place. Why did he do it? He'd heard that Hillary Clinton was running an illegal sex trafficking ring in the basement of the pizzeria, and he'd come to rescue the children. We all witnessed the riots emerging in the aftermath of the Southport, the terrible, terrible events in Southport. Again, driven by a piece of misinformation. In this case, the idea that the person who committed this terrible crime was an immigrant, and therefore we saw attacks towards violence and immigration and detention centers. So again, we're living already in an era where collective action is easier to spark through polarizing and misleading content, with all the consequences this brings. Now we will have the second poll, because we're now layered on top of this. If we can switch over to the Slido, please. Layered on top of this already existing area is the emergence of deepfakes. And deepfakes is a term, you've probably heard it before. If you haven't, usually taken to mean synthetically generated images or audio or video, which is taken to perhaps make a politician or a celebrity or someone else, make it look like they're doing or saying something that they're not actually doing or saying. So we can go onto the quiz question. So the first question was whether people had ever seen a deepfake of a politician. Now, it says before today, it doesn't count the one I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. I hope that was clear. I mean, apart from that one. Overwhelming proportions saying that they have seen this. I think this makes sense and chimes with a lot of research. Maybe we can go on to the next question, please. Do you think you could spot a deepfake? Would you know a deepfake if it was put in front of you? 45% of people saying yes. There is large representation from the AI and deepfake community in the hallway, in the room, which I think is biasing that. Many other people not sure or saying no. That's great, thank you. Can we go back to the slides, please? These results chime a lot with some survey work that we've been doing here at the Turing Institute on the spread of deepfakes. So we asked people, now this was back in March, and I think the figures have changed a lot since then, but we asked people if they'd seen before a deepfake of a politician. Around 50% were saying yes, broadly equal numbers between males and people identifying as male and people identifying as female. Similar results for public figures in general. We also asked people if they felt confident about spotting deepfakes. There, only 17% of people said that they felt confident spotting them, with the majority of people either answering don't know, as we had in the hall, or answering no, that they didn't feel confident. Now, this lack of confidence in being able to spot them, I think, is really well-founded. This is a piece of experimental work that we did just after the turn of the year, where we produced synthetically generated text outputs. We had a large language model generating information and text about elections. And we compared this with human written text. And we asked people if they could tell the difference. Now, without getting into the weeds of the experiment, all you've got along the bottom here are different types of AI model, different types of large language models. So, for example, you've got Google's Gemini here. You've got Llama 3 released by Meta. The red, and we've got people comparing AI-generated content with human-generated content. And the question was, how often do people label this content as if they thought it was human? So the higher the red box is on the side here, the more convincing the content was to people, the more that they thought it was likely to have been written by a human. And what you can see, as I said, I don't want to go through it all, but just to pick out, for me, the most striking result. There's two models, Llama and Gemini, where people were more likely to rate the AI content as having been written by a human than the human content itself. In other words, they're really struggling to tell the difference. And I think, in general, that is a good representation of where we are right now with a lot of this content. If it's placed in front of you, if you look at it in detail or you think about it in detail, maybe. But a lot of the time, the content that AI is able to create, and I think this will only be increasing, is indistinguishable, if you like, to the naked eye, or is likely to be perceived as human. And this is an area which I think, in the same way that over the last 10 or 20 years, people have learned to watch out for spam and phishing emails. You know, if someone sends you an email, you're a Nigerian prince, you have a lot of money in a bank account. You know, I'm old enough to remember when people fell for this stuff, right? But now everyone kind of knows that that's a scam. In the same way, we'll have to develop a kind of AI literacy to help us think a little bit more about these deepfakes. But what deepfakes are actually out there? What's being used? Well, some from the UK context. You may remember this one, Rishi Sunak. Does he know how to pull a pint or not? I'll leave it up to you to work out which the real image is. Okay, I hope you can work it out. This was reshared by a Labour MP who then had to apologize. And you can see how with this image, it's not as if the AI is doing all of the generation. There's just a few tweaks that are needed in order to make it, look relatively realistic and relatively convincing. Although, if you're wondering, this type of side eye, which is quite easy to generate on a photo, is becoming one of the tells, or if you see that, you should definitely have some questions about it. But there are also ones that would have been more troubling. And again, this was a few months ago, Sadiq Khan saying a fake AI audio of him nearly led to serious disorder. Someone released an audio clip of Sadiq Khan purporting to say that he supported a huge and potentially violent march throughout the streets of London around the Israel and Hamas and Gaza conflict issue. The person who released this audio later on said, well, it's what we all know Sadiq thinks. And that's very interesting. This has been shown, by the way, a number of times, that people will deliberately share misinformation if they think it's in support of a higher truth. And a lot of people, sort of say, well, okay, maybe people aren't eating pets, but in general, immigration is a problem, and it's one reason why misinformation keeps reappearing. The more extent to which these tools and technologies are placed in the hands of people who can create political content like this, I think the more deepfakes and more misleading audio we'll start to see around. We also have to bear in mind, especially in the context of UK democracy, the potential of foreign powers or other actors who want to influence democratic politics to make use of these technologies. There have been some really striking reports coming out of the US recently about how much money Russia is investing in trying to manipulate US democracy. Some of this is spent, not all of this is spent on AI by any means. You may have seen the claims that Tenet Media, a group of conservative and right-wing bloggers and YouTube personalities, was receiving millions and millions of dollars from Russian operatives, essentially, or people who work for Russia Today, a Russian news website oriented towards the West. You may have seen Microsoft's claim that Russia staged with real actors a clip purporting to show that Kamala Harris had been involved in a hit and run. But they're also starting to use these AI technologies. And again, what's coming out of the Department of Justice, I think, is extremely striking in this regard. And I'm afraid I have to mention this, one of the most disturbing trends, and which I think has important, potentially really wide-ranging consequences, is, of course, the crisis around deepfake pornography. This was a striking report from the BBC a few weeks ago, saying that over 500 schools and universities in Korea and South Korea had been targeted by deepfake pornography rings, people making deepfake pornographic images of their classmates and associates within these schools. That was found in South Korea. There's no reason to believe that that's a unique South Korean issue, or that for some reason that won't also come elsewhere. And this brings back to mind a survey that we did now almost a year ago, but I think still extremely relevant, about gender differences in online harms. We asked a whole range of questions, which I won't try and go through, but one of the things that was really striking to me is we asked people, to what extent are you comfortable expressing political opinions online, or whether you're comfortable expressing other opinions, whether you're comfortable in challenging content. And what we noticed was these really strong differences between people identifying as male and female. The females, only around 25%, saying that they are at all comfortable with the idea of expressing their political views online. Very, very few, sort of similar levels, saying they're comfortable with challenging opinions. And one of the reasons for this is because they're taking kind of protective action. They're worried about being targeted about things like pornographic deepfakes. So this is the kind of thing that can have a really widespread impact on democracy, and it's something that we're also seeing in terms of journalists, in terms of politicians, if people feel like they have to pull back from the public sphere like this. So that's the second one, collective action. Now, what about the scrutiny of elites? where does AI leave us in this regard? Well, one of the very striking changes in democratic politics, I mean, I think I've said every change is striking, but I study democracy, I'm interested in it. I apologize for that. But this is also striking, right? Bear with me. One of the really striking changes in democracy has been the emergence of what Timothy Garton Ash called platform superpowers. Very, very large technology companies which have not necessarily staff levels, but access to cash and power and user bases which are comparable in size to lots of states. This is from visualizing capitalism, and they compare the market capitalization of different companies to the GDP of different countries. And they're basically saying, comparing Apple's market capitalization of 2.1 trillion, and they color in white every country that has a smaller GDP than this Apple's market capitalization. And the entire globe basically goes white with a few exceptions. They're basically saying it's around as big as Italy. It's not an exact comparison, GDP, market capitalization. It's a bit apples to oranges, but it gives you the idea. And I think we all know the 4 or 5 or 6 companies that are going to have a similar graphic to this: Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, etc. We're now accustomed to lots of parts of our lives being run by these large technology companies. And this is important because these companies challenge democracy in lots of ways, because they can kind of act as rule setters. They can set the environment within which we operate. And they have huge impacts on people's lives. You've probably all heard about Amazon and Uber and Lyft drivers going on strike or asking for better pay and conditions. You know, why don't they just leave these companies if they're so awful? Because the companies are dominating the labor market. They're taking such a share of the labor that it's not so easy just to exit and go somewhere else. You've seen the debate, I'm sure, about an EU court ordering Apple to pay Ireland 13 billion euros in back taxes. And Ireland saying, no, we don't want that. Stop it. Getting these companies to pay, for the first time in a long time, Amazon, I also read this on the news yesterday, Amazon paid, I think it was 10 or 20 million pounds in tax in the UK. It's selling around 27 billion in goods every year. It's getting them into tax regimes is also extremely complicated. And Amazon, people have always gone, well, Amazon doesn't pay this tax. If you own a shop on a high street, you're going to be paying relatively high rates on that shop. They also affect our ability to speak. You know, whether they like it or not, they have enormous impacts on who can participate in the public sphere. And this is going back a few years, but at a certain point, Facebook decided to block Australian users from sharing or viewing the news. And it was doing that because it wasn't happy with the way that an Australian court had decided around laws related to news. But people were up in arms about this because this could seriously impact on people's ability to consume news and consume information about what's going on in the public. Now, that's what we've been dealing with over the last 10 years. With the emergence of AI, we have a whole bunch of new superpowers, if you like, coming in. Well, some of them are the same. Meta is still there. Amazon, although it hasn't done that much, is trying to train a very large model. We've also got some new players, OpenAI, which apparently now, for the first time, is deciding to move towards a for-profit company. NVIDIA, a historic is a strong word, but a chip maker that's been around for a long time, but has found its product, its chip, its GPU chip, graphics processing unit chip, to be extremely valuable for AI training. And companies like Anthropic also emerging as big players in the AI landscape. And these big players are also going to have equally big impacts. One of the things that people are starting to think about a lot is how much electricity these companies are starting to use. Again, it's comparable to big companies. This is a report on data center electricity usage. Sam Altman very recently said that the future of AI depends on an energy breakthrough. You know, he literally thinks we don't have enough energy on the planet right now to train the type of models that he would like to train. And of course, lots of people talking about its potential to fuel climate change. It's also going to have impacts on workforces. This is not the pure subject of the talk. I think the next 2 talks in this series will talk about this a lot more, but it's worth mentioning because it has big impact on democracy. Lots of people saying AI will shrink workforces. This is a very striking paper. It was just released a couple of weeks ago. Someone in my team pointed it out to me. This is the number of people using AI at work by occupation group. People in computer science, 17% of them using it every day of the week, and a further 28.5% using it at least one day per week. Extremely high uptake as a tool in job categories, which can have lots of positive impacts, but also sort of seems to presage potential shrinking of workforces. And again, just like Facebook, these companies also have a huge impact on communication. This was a really interesting case from a few months ago, which you may have seen in the news. Google paused its Gemini model, or at least its ability of this model to generate images, over concerns about how this model was interacting with prompts that asked it for people to produce human-like images. And basically what was happening was, if you asked the model to produce an image of a person, the Gemini would, without you necessarily being aware of it, try and include some diversity in the people that you're generating. So if you ask for a group of friends having a drink around the table, it would make sure that not all of these people are white men, that it would have some sort of diversity within it. A well-intentioned change. But people immediately started to play with this, and as people on the internet usually do, found a way to make this change ridiculous, asking for an image of a 1943 German soldier. And we found out that the German army in the 1940s was a lot more diverse than one might have thought through their knowledge of history. These companies have the ability to insert this kind of thing into communicative action, if you like, as you're making images or as you're making text. They rolled this back, but it shows off the general power of companies to do this. There's also the case of needing data to train themselves. In addition to needs of energy, in order to train a large AI model, you need a lot of data. And it may sound crazy to say it, but even the internet, the entire quantity of content on the internet, sometimes seems too small for these models. There's not enough data to go around. This is a great article from the Wall Street Journal. Something that you probably didn't see, because not many people went out of their way to advertise this, was changes in terms and conditions of social media companies that have been coming out over the last few weeks. And one of the key changes of these is that the data that you're putting into these platforms, if you are putting into these platforms, might start to be used to train the models. So this is what, if you go onto the Instagram page, this is just a couple of days ago, I'm sure they're changing the wording, you have the right to object to your information being used for AI at Meta. You can submit this form to exercise that right. But it's just a right to object. If your objection is honored, we won't use your public information from Facebook and Instagram. It's not clear what exactly what the circumstances are for honoring this. It's not limited to Meta at all. It's not limited to Google at all. This is what all of the big companies that store large amounts of data are now starting to think about. To what extent, it applies to Reddit, it applies to Twitter, etc. To what extent can we make use of this data for models and model training? So this brings to the last moment you have to contribute, the last poll. And I would like to know your answer to this question. I don't have any public survey information to tell me how your answers compare to the UK public, but I'd like to know the answer of your question. Would you, now that you know it's there as an option, opt in or opt out of your data being used to train an AI model? So let's go ahead and put the results up on screen as they're sort of coming in. Unsurprisingly, not like many people enchanted by the idea of their data being used to train a model. And even though, as I said, I don't have a survey that asks this question, I was looking, I'm not aware of one, I'm willing to bet that the results would come out something like this. If we can go back to the slides, please. The majority of people feeling skeptical about this idea. Now, I think this is really interesting, and I think it's going to cause debate. I completely understand why people are skeptical of this idea. Instinctively, I'm skeptical of it as well. Here's one reason why it may be more of a debate that people think. To the extent that your data goes into the model, your voice and your opinions will also be more represented in this model. And the reason we know this is because there are now very complicated high-level debates around whether models are reflecting, or what viewpoint they're reflecting. Does ChatGPT lean liberal? Is it too liberal? Is it not liberal enough? Elon Musk produced his own AI model, Grok, and he promised people it would be anti-woke. Apparently, it's not anti-woke enough. It's not being trained on enough anti-woke content. A little bit of woke has slipped through there somehow. It's very frustrating. There's these ideas that AI can help to save endangered languages if your content is in there. So for me, it's a very interesting question. If your data is out of the model, to what extent your voice is represented within it, to what extent your voice needs to be represented within it. So that was 3 ways where I think democracy has challenges, is in trouble to an extent. 3 ways in which the internet and social media have shaken up the apparatus of democracy and in a way problematized both its spread around the world and our own faith in it here. And also 3 ways in which AI contributes to these areas in a kind of messy way. I'm going to try and summarize things now and also say a few kind of positive things. When I was practicing this talk, people said, well, yeah, it's got good content, but John, you do work at an AI research institute. Shouldn't you say something positive about AI at least once? So I've got also a few positive things to say right at the end about where we think AI and democracy might be going. The first of these, and I think this is very interesting for a number of reasons, is the New York Times fighting OpenAI over whether its source material was or was not used within the training of OpenAI's models. The last time I checked, this case is still far from resolution. But also OpenAI, and this is not necessarily the only company thinking about this, agreeing to pay publishers relatively large sums of money, not enormous by any means, but relatively large sums of money, potentially on a subscription basis, for news-like content that can be used to train its models. And I think this is really interesting and potentially a positive sign. And why is that? By agreeing to pay this money and also potentially using the data in the first place, we're recognizing that AI is placing an emphasis on quality content, that this is something of import and of value for a model. And whereas I said before, social media is something that's going to prioritize divisive and inflammatory and exciting content, now we have it before as a technology that, in a way, doesn't seem to prioritize these things. It's not desperate necessarily for more social media content. It's desperate for this type of content as well. A potentially hopeful sign. There's also lots of good things we can use AI for, lots of little niche applications which are still starting to emerge. One of the big problems about being a journalist in the contemporary environment is threats to yourself, threats to your person. This was an article which, again, is less than a week old, of a news organization in Venezuela creating 2 AI avatars to broadcast their news for them. The news organization retains, according to their own promotional material, their own editorial standards. They retain the standards of a typical news organization, but they don't need to put people out in front of that. They have the AI communicating the news. In a way, it's a sad reflection, of course, of the dangers that the journalists face in Venezuela, but also an interesting use case of the technology. A third one is this article, again, very interesting, from Paul Shah, about regulating AI is easier than you think. And Shah thinks that AI companies are actually quite distinct from social media companies because of their very large hardware requirements. They need chips, they need data centers, they need electricity, they need cooling. They need a lot of things which come through the benefit from the apparatus of the state. So he sees actually great potential for regulating AI, perhaps more so than typical social media companies. But the final one of these, and I think this is the note I wanted to end on, was that even though I started looking back at the 1990s, it's important not to romanticize this era too much. I know many people out there are paying £700 for Oasis tickets. You know, we can get back there. Wouldn't it be glorious? But it wasn't all milk and honey. It wasn't all brilliant back then. And I think one of the most important things, again, from someone who studies democracy and technology, was the naivety that we had back then. The fact that we were willing to let these large social media companies run and do whatever they want. And also the people within social media basically saying, well, look, yeah, it's free speech. Everyone can get on with it. This is the type of thing that led to ISIS, the ISIS terrorist organization, organizing on Facebook and on Twitter. The terrorist organization which had a huge amount of impact. I mean, it didn't only organize on these platforms, but used them as a very important recruiting tool. And this was, you know, now 10 or 15 years ago. And now it seems quite mad to say that. We've definitely lost that kind of naivety towards technology. And what I think is very striking to me, if I look at the current wave of AI, is the incredible accent that's already being placed right now on safety. I can see some people from the Safety Institute here. You know, AI is still starting to emerge in public consciousness, and already we're making large investments in research into safety, in organizing international summits for their safety. These are things that just didn't happen with the emergence of social media. And so I think that is, for me, one of the biggest and most positive changes, and in a way has emerged out of the lessons that democracy has taken out of social media. So can democracy handle AI? I think it can, actually. And I think despite the fact that it's been a bit beaten up, these lessons of understanding technology, understanding its impact, will draw through in a really important way and help us manage AI in the future. That's everything I had to say. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it's such a shame we only have an hour, because I know you could talk about this until midnight and keep us engaged. And it was great to hear from the audience during your talk as well. And now we're going to hear more from the audience. Just a reminder, if you're in the room with us tonight, just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic round. Speak directly into the mic, just so Jonathan and our audience online can hear you. And online, the questions are going through Slido, and they're coming up for me here on the iPad. So just to kick off, we've got a question online. Can autocracy survive AI?
It's a very interesting question. It's a really interesting question. I think if you look at what's going on in China right now, how much they're taking a lead in investing in an AI and building large models, they definitely think that they can. I don't see AI posing unfortunately, I would say, I don't see it posing a huge threat to established patterns of autocratic order, let's say, around the world. I think a lot of these have largely survived some of the challenges of the 90s and 2000s. I don't know. I'd say probably they can. Alas.
Let's go to the audience now. We've got a question on the end here.
Thank you. That was really interesting. But I wonder whether we've got things around the wrong way, and whether that it's actually our belief in democracy and the erosion of democracy into technocracy that really dominates, particularly in European countries. And that's what really undermines. If we lose our real belief in the demos, the people, and the ability for us to build and create our own societies, then our AI is going to be out there as a bit of a danger, because we don't have the confidence in ourselves to be developing and running our own society, and quite happy to be governed as if we're in some sort of massive corporate enterprise, rather than being the people who govern the country.
And I think it's a really important point, and I think it's one of the huge challenges that we've seen to democracy over the last 20 years, that people feel that maybe they have a vote, but they're still not somehow in charge of things. And that's one of the things which I think we need to pay most attention to with the emergence of yet more companies which have, you know, a huge shaping impact on people's lives. One of the big pleas that lots of scholars of democracy make is don't just limit democracy to elections. You know, we have a tendency to think, the election is over, I can forget about that, and come back to it in 5 years and see how they're getting on. Democracy needs to be more of a continuous process than that.
Another question online that we've got is around the echo chambers that are created by social media. So a concern around the way that algorithms are creating echo chambers on social media and diversity of opinion is suffering. Is there anything you can say around that and its impact on democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has been a really wide-ranging area of research. The extent to which you go online and your online environment shapes you into an echo chamber, so starts to feed you with bits of information that are congruent with your beliefs, or whether it's more that you sort of go out and seek out communities of interest which fit in with what you're doing, and the online environment has less of a shaping impact. I think it's little bits of both, but what you can certainly see is that the internet has enabled what you might call kind of niche interests to survive and to thrive and to flourish. If you look, just to take one example of many, of the Unite the Right riots that we saw in the US a few years ago, these were formed through social media groups where people of diverse opinions were able to come, or, you know, diverse regions, I say, were able to come together. In a way, it's hard to imagine that without social media.
Should we have another question in the room? We've got a gentleman in the middle there.
Chris Rees. Marvin Minsky got it wrong, but all the big AI companies, like OpenAI, are aiming at AGI, artificial general intelligence. If that were to come, and I don't believe it will, for what that's worth, what effect would that have on democracy?
So I was hoping not to be asked about artificial general intelligence.
Sorry.
It's very optimistic.
Don't give him back the microphone, please. Yeah, I mean, so for people who are not familiar with the term or wondering what it might mean, I mean, there's a lot of ways of slicing this term, but artificial general intelligence to some people means an AI machine that can act in the world as if it's a human, that could go into a house and make a cup of tea without being given any instructions. To other people, it means something even more than that, computers which are starting to outstrip human capacity for intelligence, or perhaps computers that we kind of lose control of somehow. And this is one of the primary fears of some people working in the AI safety debate, that will create a machine that we're no longer able to understand or control. I'm kind of on your side, that I don't think that's imminent. I don't think that's next 6 months. I don't want to make a 10 years prediction, but you know, the technology is developing very rapidly. I mean, if we did that, if that happened, in a way, democracy is the least of our worries, I would say, but it would have a huge impact.
We've got another question at the front here.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I wanted to ask, there's been a law passed in California on deepfakes, which requires the watermarking of AI-generated content. I was just curious what the kind of view is on how technically feasible that is, and if there's any technologies like blockchain that could help enforce it.
That's a great question. So I'm really pro passing laws that, first of all, make it harder to create non-consensual deepfakes, especially of a pornographic nature, arguably exclusively of pornographic nature, of people, especially of people who aren't public figures. And I support this idea of using some kind of watermarking, which, if you're not familiar with it, will be placing some element within the technology that allows you to potentially identify where it's come from, or even the fact that it's a deepfake. I don't think there'll be perfect technological solutions. They rely on the cooperation of companies, of course. There'll be ways around them, there always are. But I think what's really critical about the current wave of deepfakes is it's not that they're new. They've been around for 5 years, but the technology is suddenly in the hands of people that it wasn't in the hands of before, and it's really easy to use. So especially in the area of sexualized content, I think that this could make potentially a really important difference.
We've got another question online, again, a very big one. Do you think AI one day could replace governments?
Find an easier one next one, right? Okay. I study the impact of technology. I'm not in there creating the technology itself. I'm not certain about when these super intelligent AIs are coming, if they're coming at all. From the evidence that I've read and tried to balance out in my own mind, as I said, I'm skeptical that this is imminent, but perhaps it's starting to come. I think we can see the potential of AI to help right now with some functions of government. This is one project we're working on, the Turing. Could it help government understand more citizen preferences? For example, could it summarize them automatically? These kind of things. I think we're a long way before we have an AI government, and I think, will people want it? I don't know. Unclear, definitely.
We've got another question right at the front.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This was great. My question is about how the term democracy is sometimes kind of co-opted to mean a very specific thing in AI. So I think there's all these open source AI communities that talk about the democratization of the access of AI, and that's like a very important thing. And it kind of counters to your image of like Apple taking over the world. But at the same time, it allows the proliferation of access to, like you mentioned, deepfakes and potentially harmful technologies. So how do you feel about open source AI in the AI democracy debate? And basically, are you Team Zuck or Team Altman?
I didn't realize I'd have to pick one of these. It's a great question, and I think it's one that's going to be a huge debate over the next couple of years, and there's going to be legislative efforts to either support open source AI, so models that anyone can theoretically have access to right now. For example, Meta largely makes their Llama model available as sort of open access. You can debate about whether this is true open source, compared to models such as the OpenAI one, where you basically have to pay for access. My view is that the technology is going to be out there anyway, and that therefore it's a positive thing, the extent to which other people can also have the technology and benefit from it. That's largely where I am on this debate. Of course, it's always going to be easier to have more security measures if we keep the technology limited. But I think I see greater benefits for the open source side of the coin.
Thanks. We've got another question at the back.
Hi, great talk, thank you. Do you think that AI is actually going to affect also the expression of democracy, so that it will actually affect more fraud in our electoral systems, or even the perception of fraud? Obviously with Stop the Steal and everything else that's happening with Trump.
I mean, this is a really great question as well, and this is one of the challenges that we've seen in general in terms of misinformation and deepfakes, is that even when we've tried to introduce, let's say, fact checks on content, people's confidence in media in general starts to drop. And this sort of speaks to your point that, will we start to lose a little bit of confidence in democracy? There was this great anecdote put to me by someone at the Turing last week of the Reform Party candidate who was supposed to be AI generated. And this briefly ran around the news. He's got a made-up profile pic. He wasn't at the hustings. This is an AI candidate. It turned out he was just ill. And he couldn't make the hustings, and no, he wasn't generated by AI. Yeah, I think it's something that introduces yet another important element of concern in people's mind, and I think it's really important. I expect many more efforts in this area in the coming years, that people have the ability to consume media and information that they kind of trust and don't think it's all manipulated.
Got another question over there at the end.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for the talk. So I can see why the paradigm that we've developed for thinking about social media is so appealing for thinking about AI, because there's so many similarities, and you highlighted many of them in your talk, right? They're made by these big tech companies, and there's problems with misinformation and so on. But it strikes me that there's also this tremendous difference as well, which is that whereas social media has primarily been a decentralizing influence for the media, AI is a re-centralizing influence, and it is for the very reasons that you highlighted at the end, which is that, you know, to train these models, you need more money than God and more power than the sun. So given that that means necessarily that the access to these models is going to be restricted to a few actors, and thus there's going to be this re-centralizing process, what impact do you think that has on the ways that the phenomena that you discussed in your talk will play out? And will they be different to those for social media?
It's a fascinating point, and I think it's really well made. I mean, one of the reasons that I often look at it through the prism of social media, apart from the fact that, you know, that's the kind of analytical categories we have, is also one of the proximate impacts of AI is to change the way that social media content is generated. And this is kind of the first place that people are consuming a lot of their AI, and a lot of the social media companies have the power to train the models, but they're also interested in it because Facebook wants you to be using the AI assistant when you're using it. Or if you're on Instagram, you can put a beautiful filter on your face and, you know, suddenly I will look like I'm in the 1990s again. Isn't it wonderful? So I think I do have that prism on it. Will it change communication such that it centralizes communication back into a way it was maybe a little bit in the pre-social media era when you have just a few actors in the public sphere? I don't know, or I don't know as much about that. I think in a way it centralizes this type of part of communication, a kind of communication layer, which previously we've not been used to separating out from communication. In a way, you know, I think we're still to feel the full impact of this, definitely.
We've got another kind of both technical and almost philosophical question online.
Pass. Yeah.
If AI is trained on the web, and the web is predominantly early 21st century text, then will democracy be constrained to early 21st century ideas and notions?
I mean, this is one of the very fascinating aspects, which is someone who's outside the training of technology still finds really interesting to read about. You know, these tools are so data hungry that they reach back into the past and pull out any text that they can find. One of the early things that we saw in some of the earlier models, this goes back a couple of years, has by and large been fixed, is the re-emergence of racial stereotypes which have been debunked a long time ago. For example, the idea that white people and non-white people had different thresholds for pain or needed different access to pain medication, things which, you know, are kind of 100 years old, but had also completely fallen by the wayside, suddenly re-emerging. So these need to reach back into the historical archives has this really important, I think, shaping impact. One of the big challenges for AI companies right now is to somehow find a way of keeping the model current. Like, you know, how can you train it on just the most recent set of data? And I think this is a big technological challenge which people are working on right now.
We've got another question down here.
Is there, thank you for a great talk, Jonathan. Is there a collective effort to build a body of regulatory guidelines, certainly to protect the workforce around the world? You showed us 2 avatars, news avatars. Is there any sort of work that Alan Turing Institute is doing? And also, is there anything that's sort of binding the nations together in making sure that the workforce around the world is protected?
So we have a team specializing in regulation that's bringing together a lot of standards. I'm not going to embarrass Florian by calling him onto the stage to talk about it. But I think it's a critical issue right now because a lot of states are facing exactly the same challenges and exactly the same way of thinking about it. So there are a couple of things going on at the Turing right now to sort of bring some of these efforts together, also in terms of ethics and responsible innovation, which I'm sure we can share the materials afterwards somehow.
Definitely. We've got a question right at the back.
Thank you for your talk, Jonathan. I don't speak very well in public, but I do the best I can, but try to speak slowly. Thank you for your talk, Jonathan, and thank you for the Turing Institute for organising this event. There's a lot of emphasis on democracy. Question, why? When it's so manipulated by propaganda, etc. Justice, where does justice fit in this? If we had justice, we wouldn't have the North-South divide.
I mean, this is a really good point as well, and I think it's not something that I've addressed Where did democracy come from? Someone emailed me saying, John, can you do a talk on democracy? That's how we got here. But I think justice is an important part of it. One of the interesting impacts that the AI is potentially having on the justice system, I put a slide in about this, but I took it out in the end, was how can we have secure notions of evidence within the justice system if we live in a world where suddenly audio and video and text content can't be trusted in the way it was sort of 10 years ago. There was a really interesting case in the US of a high school principal being accused of racism and anti-Semitism on the basis of an audio file, and this audio file was turned out to be fake. But there's also other cases of people saying, no, that audio file wasn't me, it's a fake, even though it's real. So I think these sort of technologies, these synthetic technologies, are going to have profound impacts in all sorts of different areas of society in a way that we're only sort of just coming to terms with.
We've got a question right here at the back, yeah.
It's really brilliant, Jonathan, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about this myself, having worked in Universal Music Group for 20 years, and loved your Britpop slide. And it really boils down to the fact that, Phil, we're on iOS and Android, and do we need a new operating system?
I mean, you know, it's a fantastic question, and it's very striking when you start to count it up. You know, the amount of small companies that have an impact on all parts of your daily life. You know, all of this talk was prepared on a system. You're taking the questions on an iPad. Do we need a new operating system? It would be fascinating to see it. How could we bring it in? How could we make it happen is the massive challenge.
Great. We've got a question down here.
Hi, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Do you have any research done on the development of AI in the global south? So we're here pitching it from Europe and the United States and the companies within those. So what do you know of, especially with the issue of the need for energy and data? So is anybody else interested in developing it that, you know, from those regions, and how do you think we're missing that in the development of AI?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, as an aside, there's someone called Anna Valvidia who works in Oxford who has studied, you know, you mentioned the need for data and energy. A lot of these data and energy centers are being located in the global south. She'd been to Mexico recently to study a very large data center, which is not necessarily there for any other reason other than they can get lots of access to water in a way that's hard to do in regulations in terms of the global north. So that has a big impact. But there's also the case, and this sort of gets back a little bit to what I was talking about at the beginning, definite concerns by lots of groups of people, and not just in the global south, also in the global north, of being left behind by AI. For example, we have great language models for English, but in the UK, there are many other spoken languages. What about those? Can we get a language for Welsh, or can we have language? You know, a couple of days ago, I was talking to someone from Slovenia. There's only 2 million speakers of the language. How can we ever get enough content to have a model that supports our language? So I think these are also really important challenges for AI. And that's one of the reasons why I think we're starting to see a lot of national efforts in these areas to sort of say, look, we can't just wait for a tech company to make a Slovenian AI model. We need to make an effort ourselves.
I've got another question online, Jonathan. Since most of the material available for model training will be generated by AI in the future, will AI become less and less relevant to humans?
Well, this is certainly a theory that we're going to, I mean, it feels very probable that if you take the web at large and just sort of measure proportions, larger and larger amounts of that are going to be generated by synthetic media. I think to an extent this will come to feel natural in the same way that we're used to using predictive text on our phones, or as I said, we're used to putting some filters on our images to make them look a little bit more exciting. I think we're going to start to get used to having an AI model help us do some of our content creation. But it does raise big questions about how useful this will be in training going forward. I guess it depends what the use is of it. If the usefulness is supposed to be access to authentic human creativity, and it's all AI-generated content, then of course it won't give you that. If it's more mundane stuff, like a write-up of the news or a write-up of what's going on in an area of science, it might be less impactful.
I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. We've got someone down here.
Thanks so much for a fantastic lecture. I wonder if you have any insight on the impact that particularly generative AI tools have on kind of softer skills and capacities that citizens in democracies, kind of that is crucial for citizens in democracies to have, such as even like ability to make an argument or to accept a different opinion or to assess information as such. And the question is really coming or is motivated by experience, by what's happening in higher education at the moment, where students are using generative AI tools to complete even the most mundane tasks instead of engaging and learning to critically reflect material and learn to kind of debate ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. I mean, one of the, I work in higher education, and one of the real worrying themes of the future is that this might be students submitting AI-generated essays, which are then marked by another AI. And the students and the professors themselves have nothing to do with it. Just let the AI get on with it. I mean, it's certainly one of the possible futures that people start to miss out on a lot of skills they previously had. I'm reminded when Amazon's Alexa assistant, the Siri assistant, started to come in, and this was obviously many years back, there were studies on the impact of children. And it showed children becoming ruder because you get used to bossing this machine around. Turn on the lights, buy me a computer game, this kind of thing. And that's a minor example. What's going to be the impact? And I do think we will see this. What's going to be the impact when we start to get used to search is typing something into an assistant and getting the assistant to bring us an answer and pre-formatted rather than looking through the answers ourselves. I don't know what the impact is, but I think it's going to have big changes, as you're saying.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. That's all we've got time for in terms of questions. Thanks so much for joining us this evening and for all of these fantastic questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them. If you're lucky in the audience, you'll be able to catch Jonathan outside at the drinks later. I think we'll end with one final question, which I won't ask you to answer, Jonathan. But great lecture tonight, but how do we know that the speaker is human? And on that note, our next Turing lecture will be delivered by Dr. Abeba Bahane on 14th of October, and she'll be exploring the question, can we trust AI? And you can find out more about that with the QR code here. Finally, on behalf of everyone at the Alan Turing Institute and everyone at the Knowledge Quarter, I'd like to thank Jonathan for joining us, for all of you in the audience online and in here and all your questions. And let's go to the drinks reception.